Okay, thank you all for coming to this research talk. This is the first research talk for the semester. So I am Arnab Bhattacharya. So I'm an assistant professor in the School of Computing. So today I'll be telling you about some recent results that we have, that me and my collaborators have. Some of these results are quite new. In fact, one of them is not even out in public yet. Okay? So these are new algorithms for efficient statistical inference. So let me begin by telling you what statistical inference is, right? So it all begins with a data set. So suppose you have a huge population, and then in this population you have drawn some samples. So for each of the individuals in this sample, you have recorded n measurements. So n variables that you have recorded. So in these days and times, it's quite easy to take lots of measurements. So suppose that we are in particular going to look at high dimensional data sets where you have a lot of variables that you observe for each sample. Okay, so here, so n is the number of variables for which we have samples, and then you have a bunch of these samples. Okay, so now you have this data set, and the question is, what do you want to do with it? Okay, so how do I want to understand this data set? So the fundamental thesis of data science is that each observation can be viewed as a draw from a data distribution, from a probability distribution. So this distribution is a distribution on n variables. Okay, and so each time you draw from this distribution, you get one of these sample data points. Now, I mean, you could quibble with this postulate. In particular, this independent draw is quite a strong assumption that each time you get a sample, it's an independent draw. And at the very end of this talk, we'll talk about how to get around the restrictions around this thesis. But for now, let's take this as given. So this is how data is postulated to be given to you as independent draws from a distribution. And in fact, this can be realized easily in some settings, in particular if you have randomization and you can randomly draw individuals from the population. Okay. And then what is statistical inference? So suppose you have many of these draws from a data distribution. The question is to learn interesting properties of this data distribution D. Right? By the way, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to write in the chat. So I'll be monitoring that. So if there's something urgent, then I can just reply to it immediately. So, okay, so this is all good and nice. But the problem is that if this data distribution is arbitrary, you cannot really do much. Right? The reason is basically that each draw of the distribution can just yield something totally unexpected. Right? Because the distribution is just unrestricted, so there's no limit to essentially the amount of diversity you can see in the data set. So in order to do anything meaningful, we need to be able to restrict we need to consider only restricted kinds of data distributions, and these restrictions are what are called statistical models. Okay? And the reason that we can put such a restriction on data sets, on the data distribution, is because usually the data distribution is not found like a distribution in the wild. So it's a product of some physical process. So there's some action which is going on in nature or in your system or something, and that is creating these samples which you see in your data set. Okay, so let's just see an example. So a classical example of a statistical model is a linear model. So here what you have is each data point consists of some n-1 covariates, which will term as x. X is in bold because it's a vector. And then the last element, this last coordinate, is actually the guy that you care about. This is what's called the output variable. Okay, and it may happen as a result of the physical process which is generating this data set. This y can be thought of as a linear function of the covariates x. Okay, so in that case, the distribution looks as you have on the right hand side. So you have x, which may be from some arbitrary distribution, and then the last coordinate is a linear function of the covariates x plus perhaps some noise which you can model as a Gaussian. So this is a very typical kind of statistical model that you can put on a data set. And then the relevant inference problem here is from these samples, you want to recover coefficients of the linear function L. So this is called the linear regression problem, right? Which I'm sure you have seen somewhere in your journey to grad school. Okay. So in this talk, we'll be focusing on, so the way I operate, my group operates, is by focusing on kind of two different kinds of themes. So one theme is to identify interesting statistical models. And these models are often motivated by causal inference. So this is a separate topic, which I won't really mention at all throughout this talk, but it's kind of underlies some of these problems that I'll discuss, and it's an undercurrent that will flow across this talk. But for that, I need a lot more time, so I won't really talk about causal inference. And also, these statistical models are generated by applications in economics, biology, and beyond. Okay, and now, given these statistical models, we want to design and analyze efficient algorithms for high-dimensional inference problems on these statistical models. And when I talk about inference, there are two different axes that we'll consider. One is sample efficiency. So where sample efficiency means that you want to limit the number of samples, the number of draws from the data distribution that you observe. And the second is time efficiency. So even after you have seen the samples, it is no use if you need a lot of time to actually go over these samples in order to generate the result of your inference algorithm. So I want an efficient algorithm which, when given the samples, can produce the result I'm looking for. So we'll consider sample efficiency and time efficiency, and for interesting statistical models. Okay. So the way I'll structure this talk is break it up into three parts, and these three parts are going to be kind of different. So in the first third, I'll talk about efficient distance approximation. Then I'll talk about regression from truncated samples. And then finally, I'll talk about independence testing over a stream. Okay. And again, so the way I'll operate is that so each of these themes I'm going to talk about, and then after that I'll stop. And then if people have questions, then I'm going to answer those questions. Okay. All right. Just 1 second. Oh. Again, so I'll be looking over the chat. So if you have questions, just comment over the chat, right? Okay. So the first topic is efficient distance approximation. So this is based on a joint work with Sutanu Gayan, Kuldeep Neel, and Vinod Chandran. So Sutanu Gayan is a research fellow here at NUS. He has been working with me over the last year. So he will be here for 1 more year at least. Kuldeep Neel is an assistant professor here, and NV Vinod Chandran, so he's a faculty at University of Nebraska in the US, but he was visiting the school over the last year as part of his sabbatical when we did this work. Okay. So the work is actually not published yet, but you can find it publicly on arXiv. All right, so let me motivate the distance approximation problem. So again, let's say that you have a data set, and which is generated by some data distribution D. And so there's a scientist who observes this data set, but then she already has in mind some hypothesis about how the data is being generated, right? So this is what scientists do. So they have some theoretical model about how this data is being generated. And a very relevant question is for her to ask, does the data match with my hypothesis? So in particular, you could ask this computational problem: how close is this data distribution D to my hypothesis H? Okay, so H is one distribution, D is the data distribution, and you want to find out how close they are. So if they are very close, then the scientist will say, aha, I have a match for what I observe in nature. If it's far, then she'll have to go back to her desk and try to derive a new model, new hypothesis. Okay. So the first question you may ask is, what do I mean by close, right? So how do I measure the distance between two distributions? And there are various ways to do this. So the one that I'll focus on for this part of the talk is on total variation distance. So total variation distance has a very natural interpretation. So what it means is that, so the total variation distance between two distributions is large if there is some event that happens with high probability in one distribution but low probability in the other distribution. Meaning that for some event E, the absolute value of the difference between P of E and Q of E is large. Okay? And an interesting fact about total variation distance. So by the way, I mean, total variation distance is quite a strong notion, right? So if the total variation distance is small, it means that there is no event E which you can use to distinguish between P and Q. So if D is close to H in total variation distance, that really means that there is, I mean, there's no kind of property of the variables which is different in the data distribution versus in the hypothesis distribution. And it so happens that this total variation measure has a different formulation, which is quite convenient, and we'll return to it at least twice in this talk. So if you think about it, right, so the maximum of this difference actually happens. I mean, you can write down the event when P of E minus Q of E is large, because basically the sum of P of X. So these are atomic events. So when I mean P of X, X is just an atomic event, meaning that it's, I mean, it's so E. So there's a sample space. So this is the sample space, if you have seen some probability, and E is a subset of the sample space. So it's the, I mean, it's a subset of a sample space where some event occurs. And X, by X, I mean each particular item in the sample space, okay? So you can write this maximum as basically those, I mean, like this event consists of those X's for which P of X is more than Q of X, right? And if you think about it, then you can kind of reformulate this max as basically half of the difference between P of X and Q of X for each X taken individually, okay? This is in the discrete case, and if you have a continuous distribution, which means that you have a density function, let's say P of X and Q of X are the density functions, then again you can write the total variation in terms of this integral. Okay. So again, the question now is, given your data distribution D and your hypothesis H, I want to estimate this total variation distance to within some error. Okay. And our main result here is that we can actually give time and sample efficient algorithms for distance estimation if D and H satisfy certain structural models, certain statistical models. So in particular, if D and H are multivariate normal distributions, meaning Gaussian distributions, or they are Bayesian networks over fixed graphs, or they are Ising models, then we can estimate the total variation distance efficiently. Okay. So I won't really have time to go over all of these things, but I'll try to give you an overview of how our algorithm works, and in particular we'll look at the distributions being just multivariate normal distributions, because that's the simplest case, and that gives you an idea of what the algorithm looks like. All right, so what is a multivariate normal distribution? For those of you who haven't seen it, it is basically the generalization of the standard normal distribution, the univariate normal distribution, where in just one dimension you have a Gaussian density. So n mu sigma denotes the normal distribution with mu as the mean. So this is the mean, and then the covariance matrix sigma. Okay, so the covariance matrix, this is the expectation of x transpose when x is drawn from the distribution. Okay, and so if this sigma, so I mean, yeah, essentially n mu sigma looks like points in high dimensions. It essentially looks like points on the surface of an ellipsoid. and the kind of the eccentricities of the ellipsoid are given by this this matrix sigma. So if sigma was the identity matrix, this is just a sphere. Okay? And you can explicitly write down the density function of a standard normal distribution in terms of mu and sigma. Okay. Now again, what do we want to do, right? So you have two distributions. So D, which is a normal distribution with, let's say, mean mu D and covariance metric sigma D, and you have a hypothesis H with mean mu H and covariance matrix sigma H. Okay, and H is known to you because that's what the scientist has. Okay, she has H, but the parameters for D are not known. So that's the data distribution, right? So here's a very natural approach. So what you can do is you can just learn mu hat and sigma hat from the data. So you take some, so here it's enough to take theta n square samples, and then you look at the mean of those samples, that's mu hat, and you look at the empirical covariance of those n square samples, that's sigma hat, and you can prove that basically this the distribution that you get by making the mean to be mu hat and the covariance to be sigma hat, this is actually close to the data distribution in total variation distance. Okay, so now we have so we don't have D, so D is just a data distribution, but we have a sufficiently close distribution which is given by mu hat and sigma hat. And we wanted to measure the distance between D and H. Well, okay, so maybe not between D and H, but we'll measure the distance between this n mu hat, sigma hat, and H. And so if we measure this distance to plus minus epsilon by 2, and the error between D and this n mu hat, sigma hat is also epsilon by 2, so then we'll estimate the total variation distance between D and H to plus minus epsilon by the triangle inequality, which this total variation distance satisfies. So there's no need for more samples. I mean, all that's needed is to estimate this. And this is a purely computational problem, right? Because H is just given to you, mu hat, sigma hat are just numbers that you have found out. So you can compute this. But the problem is actually really in the computation. So sample compute efficiency is not an issue. So this is something that's been known for a long time, how to get estimates which are close. But the issue is, like, if you want to estimate this distance, then you have to do this integration, right? And what you have to realize is that this integration is over an n-dimensional space, because we're in this high-dimensional regime where each x is in Rn. Okay, so it's a multi-dimensional integration, and this can take exponential time. Okay. And this is essentially our main contribution. So what we realize is that instead of explicitly computing this integral, you can do something a bit more clever. Okay, so you can write the total variation distance as the integral of the difference between p of x and q of x, not over all x, but over those x's for which p of x is greater than q of x. So you have to realize that p of x and q of x, both of them, their total mass is 1. So the total mass where p of x is greater than q of x is the same as the total mass where q of x is greater than p of x, because both of them add up to the same value 1, right? So I can actually, I can translate this half to just looking at that part of the mass where p of x is greater than q of x. Okay. So this absolute value is actually not necessary here. You can put parentheses because you are restricting to p of x being greater than q of x. By the way, this notation, what that means is that I mean it's 1. This value is 1 when p of x is greater than q of x, and it's 0 otherwise. Okay, and then you can just apply some algebraic manipulation. So you can divide by p of x and multiply by p of x. And then what you realize is that this is actually an expectation. So it's an expectation over x drawn from p of 1 minus q of x over p of x times this indicator that p of x is greater than q of x. Okay, and once you have an expectation, it naturally kind of lends itself to a Monte Carlo approach. So instead of trying to do this expectation explicitly, what we can do is, instead of so we can draw several samples from X. Okay, so this X is, this expectation is over all of the X in the distribution, but we don't need to do this expectation. So we can just draw some M samples from P, X1 through Xm, and we can look at the sample average of this quantity. Okay, and the cool thing is that we can do this because we can write, we actually have explicit kind of knowledge of what Q of X and P of X look like, right? Because Q of X and P of X are exactly the density function for the standard normal distribution. So we really know exactly what it looks like, and that's why we can do it for sorry, one second. Okay, yeah. So that's why we can do it exactly for the density function of the normal distribution. Okay. So this is fine. So this is the final algorithm then. So you obtain empirical estimates mu hat and sigma hat, and you let p hat be n of mu hat sigma hat. Okay. And then you invoke this estimator for total variation distance using additional samples from H and knowledge of the density functions for p hat and H. And together you get a plus minus epsilon estimate of the total variation distance with high probability using polynomially many samples and time. And yeah, so just to comment, I mean, this estimator for total variation distance actually was defined earlier in a very different context by Cannon and Rubenfeld, but we use it here for a very different problem, for doing statistical inference on high dimensional models, whereas their application was kind of more artificial and theoretical. And this kind of begs the question. So here, the way we did distance approximation is that we first actually learned the parameters, right? And then having learned the parameters, we have an estimator for the total variation distance. Can you be more efficient? I mean, it's not a priori clear that you need to learn the parameters in order to do distance approximation. And in some settings, it is known that you can get slight savings by not doing parameter learning before distance approximation. But in this case, it's not clear. Okay, so this is, I think, a very interesting open question. Okay, so with that being said, I'll move to the second part of this talk, which is regression from truncated samples. Again, this is also very new work. So this is with Ratin Desai, Nagarajan, and Yanis Panagias. So Ratin Desai was a research staff who was working with me earlier, and Nagarajan and Panagias are at SUTD. So now Panagias is an assistant prof there at SUTD. He's a collaborator of mine. Okay, so let's look at truncated samples. So first, I need to tell you what truncated samples are. Okay, so let's look at this problem of predicting basketball ability. So let's say that I want to understand how the height of a person affects their ability to play basketball. Okay, so if you so the true data distribution looks something like this, something like what you have in the blue dots. So you have like this roughly increasing tendency with height, and and you can do linear regression and find this line which kind of minimizes the least squares error. Okay, but the issue that we'll look at is truncation. Okay, so the issue in truncation is that you don't actually get to see the true data distribution. So what you get to see is a truncated version of it. So for example, in this case, suppose I base my study of the relationship between height and basketball ability only by looking at NBA basketball players. Okay, so now that induces a bias, right? So that, I mean, means that I'm only looking at those individuals whose basketball ability is above some certain threshold. Okay, and the relationship between height and basketball ability for this subset may be different than for the entire data distribution. So it may not be a true indicator of the relationship between height and basketball ability. And indeed here, if you minimize least squares, you find this kind of shallower line, and this flatter line, which gives this, which minimizes least squares error. And this may be just because, I mean, people who are good enough for NBA have roughly similar skills anyways. So then, I mean, that gives you a flatter line. But then, I mean, the connection between height and basketball ability is more prominent when basketball ability is low. Okay, and this is exactly the kind of problem. So here, basically, you have ability, which is a function maybe of height and some other parameter epsilon. And then this ability determines whether someone plays in the NBA or not. And then if that person plays in the NBA, you observe it because that's what the data set looks like. And if it's no, the player is just unobserved because, I mean, my data set just doesn't contain individuals who are not in the NBA. Okay, so the truncation only observed data based on the value of yi. And this is actually a very important problem throughout statistics and econometrics, particularly in economics. I mean, when people do, say, income or wage studies, it often turns out that in the sample, poor people are not represented well enough because poor people maybe don't report their income. Okay, and then that leads to this truncation or selection bias, where you are only looking at the relationship between, say, the income and other covariates when the income threshold, when the income is above some threshold. Okay, so this has inspired lots of prior work, but ours is kind of the first work which looks at this problem in more detail as a technical computational problem. So the setting we look at is again high dimensional linear regression. So the problem, the toy problem I mentioned in the last slide, was where you had one covariate height. But typically in modern studies, you are not measuring the connection between one variable and the output variable, but you have hundreds of variables, say, and you're trying to understand the relationship between, say, basketball ability and these other measurements that you have. And again, the goal is to identify parameters for the untruncated distribution. Okay? And we'll make an assumption, and that assumption is that we can check whether some particular data point y, I mean, whether a particular value of the output variable y would be truncated or not. Okay, so this perhaps makes sense in the basketball example, because you can check maybe whether I mean, there's some particular threshold above which someone qualifies for basketball, for NBA, and you can check whether your y passes that bar or not. Okay, so this is kind of an assumption that we make, and it is reasonable to ask, I mean, what if you make weaker assumptions? Okay, so so first, before we talk about high dimensional linear regression with truncation, let me just first tell you about high dimensional linear regression where there's no truncation. So there are many algorithms for high dimensional linear regression. The kind of the state-of-the-art representative is Lasso, which was first proposed by Tibshirani in '96, when he didn't realize the power of what he had suggested. And it was only later, when there was more computational power available, and when people realized the power of high dimensions, that the Lasso came into the forefront. So what the Lasso algorithm does is it finds these coefficients theta, which minimizes the squared error, as well as a regularization term, which is a constant parameter multiplied by the L1 norm of theta, so of the coefficient. So the L1 norm is just the sum of the absolute value of the coefficients. And the Lasso and its variants, as I said, they are currently the algorithms of choice for high dimensional linear regression, and the above optimization can be solved very efficiently. And in particular, Lasso is used a lot for the variable selection problem. So often what happens is that even though you have taken a huge number of measurements, so you have n covariates where n is very large that you have measured, only k of them really matter for predicting your output variable. So only k of the n covariates are relevant in determining the output variable. And the variable selection problem is to identify these k. And the Lasso actually works beautiful for this task, and that's why, I mean, so Tibshirani's original paper had this word shrinkage. So what it means is that Lasso kind of naturally shrinks the small coefficients to 0. Okay, so there are only a few coefficients which are given non-zero values, and the other coefficients get 0 values. So Lasso naturally gets to variable selection, and you can prove theoretical guarantees about when how many samples you need in order to get variable, in order to recover the correct set of k variables. And it turns out that k log n variables, k log n samples in enough. So again, even if kn is very, very large, you only get log of n in the sample complexity. So the number of samples can actually be much fewer than the number of variables that you are observing. Okay, and k is typically much smaller than n. So for truncated linear regression with truncated samples, we introduce the truncated lasso, which does something very similar. It's again a loss function plus lambda times the L1 regularizer. But the loss function we have is the sample log likelihood for the truncated model instead of least squares, which corresponds to the sample log likelihood for the untruncated model. So it's a very natural generalization of the previous lasso algorithm. And what we show is that, again, as the number of samples grows, theta converges to the true parameters. So even if you're seeing only the truncated samples, I can recover the parameters of the untruncated samples, okay, by taking into account the truncation in the likelihood function. Okay? And we can recover relevant variables under some reasonable assumptions with about k squared log n samples. So instead of k log n, we have a k squared log n. And the assumptions are also a bit more. And there are some, severe challenges associated with analyzing this truncated lasso. Although the algorithm is similar, our analysis kind of needs to be very complicated. So the first observation is that this log likelihood function, which I haven't written down, is convex, but it's not strongly convex when n is very, very large. So what strongly convex means is that, so it can be flat in some directions, okay? So it's, you have to understand that this is in like a huge number of dimensions, in n dimensions where n is very large. So it's not really possible to properly visualize this. But the intuition is that it's flat in some directions and it's curved nicely upwards in some other directions. Okay, and we don't know which of these directions it's curved upwards in. If we knew, that would kind of point out those k relevant variables. Now, this problem of not being strongly convex is actually true even in the untruncated. Okay, so there is a particular technique which people have developed to analyze lasso, which for that you first need to look at L, the log likelihood, just restricted to the relevant variables. And in the untruncated setting, what is hugely useful is that L restricted to the relevant variables is actually strongly convex, meaning that it has a unique minimum. So it looks actually like this, no matter which direction you're looking at, okay, which slice you're looking. But here, because of the truncation, you don't get this strong convexity. So it's not clear that an algorithm would actually converge to the global minimum. So what we show is that even though it's not strongly convex, it's actually strongly convex in a neighborhood around the true parameters. Okay, there's some theta star, which is the actual set of k variables which determines the output variable. And if you look, and if somehow you are inside that region, then you have strong convexity. Okay, and furthermore, we show that you can tune lambda so that the objective optimum lies in this neighborhood. So if you had an algorithm which solved this truncated lasso objective, then you would be actually inside the strongly convex region, and so you would really converge to the true parameters. And this is in the case when the relevant variables are known, but you really need to analyze a setting where you don't have the relevant variables. And there is this particular method called the primal dual witness method, which kind of goes from the case when the relevant variables are not known to the case when the relevant variables are known. Okay. Yeah, although the implementation is similar, the details are again quite a bit more complicated. Independent to our work, there was a parallel work by a group at MIT by Daskalakis, Rohatgi, and Zampetakis. So they also look at the same problem, but they don't look at variable selection. They look at the problem of minimizing the squared error between the regression output and the the true parameters. Okay, and moreover, what they do is they also give a computationally efficient algorithm. So kind of I mean, we achieve a stronger result in the sense that we can do variable selection and not just minimize L2 error. But on the other hand, our result is weaker in that we only can bound the number of samples, but not the time. Okay, it turns out that we don't know how to solve that this lasso problem I told you about in a polynomial time efficient way. So an open question here is to give a computationally efficient algorithm for variable selection from truncated linear models. So maybe at this time, I'll just stop for 2 minutes. If people have questions, then I can answer those before I move on to the final part of my talk. So far, I have talked about 2 of the results. And yeah, there's a third part which is coming up. But these 3 are quite different. So if you have questions about what we have talked about so far, then I mean, feel free to just speak up. Okay, so Shini is asking, what is the intuition behind tuning lambda to allow the objective function to lie in the optimum neighborhood? Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, yeah, I mean, you want to tune, I mean, so the setting of lambda has to be such that on the one hand, it should not be so small that you are not enforcing sparsity. So if lambda was equal to 0, then basically in the least square solution, you would not be having the shrinkage property. So there would be each coefficient would have some small value. But here, so that's why you need to make lambda at least something. But also on the other hand, you cannot make lambda too large because then it will overwhelm the true objective, and just that itself will determine. So yeah, so you can choose lambda in such a way that basically there's something called the restricted null space property, which kind of looks at the mass of the optimum solution on the non-relevant variables versus the relevant variables. And lambda can be chosen so that you have more mass on the relevant variables than in the non-relevant variables in the optimum. And that is useful in the rest of the analysis. I'm sorry, it's a bit technical, so I can't really say, yeah, I mean, I can't really put it clearly here. But I encourage you to look at the paper also. I think the proof is pretty short for this question. So another question is, with the assumption of this problem, can we know about the threshold of each variable? Yeah, so I guess what you're asking is, can you estimate each variable, each coefficient's value, not just if it's relevant or not? Is that the question? Okay, I'm not seeing it. Okay, yeah, I mean, so it is definitely relevant. So this is called L infinity estimation. So basically, you're trying to bound the maximum error on each coefficient, and we actually do prove that also, that not only can you identify, but you can actually bound each of the coefficients. Yeah. So why we need the assumption? Which assumption are you talking about? So under reasonable assumptions, this one. So here you need to make some assumptions, because we essentially need to kind of ensure that you are getting many different values of x, right? So for example, suppose like you were looking at the same value of x over and over and over again. So then obviously I do not give you information. So you need x's to be sufficiently independent of each other in some sense. And then also you need the truncation. It cannot be too much of a truncation. So if you see there's a very, very tiny sliver of the data, then there's not much you can do. So you need some lower bound on how much data you are seeing. Okay. So these are the kinds of assumptions which go in. Okay. Okay, so let me move on to the third part of the talk, which is independence testing over a stream. So this is joint work with Ratin Desai, again, who was an intern here earlier, E. Lee, who's an assistant prof at NTU, and David Woodruff, who's our collaborator. He's at Carnegie Mellon, CMU. Okay, so this paper is in submission, but if people are interested, then I can individually send them a draft, which can be kept confidential. Okay. So first, let me tell you about independence testing. Right? So independence testing is sort of the most basic statistical model you can put on n variables, meaning that they are just, the n variables are just independent random variables. So there's no correlation between them. So they just act independently. And this assumption of independence is used in many places. So for example, there's this principle of independent assortment in computational biology, which basically says that different genes have different values. So the alleles means what state the gene is in, and so the alleles for different genes are completely independent. So mutations which act on one part of the gene, on one part of the genome, don't affect another gene. So again, this is an assumption, and this assumption of independent assortment is not always valid. But this is a statistical model that people put on genes. Similarly, for database columns, if you want to design query planning algorithms for databases, then often these algorithms are much more efficient if you assume that some columns are independent. Okay, so it's important to so that is also a model again that people put, that columns are independent. Similarly, in network monitoring, if you look at traffic at different routers, then the usual assumption is that they are independent. The traffic is independent. If they are not independent, if they are correlated, then that basically indicates that there's some kind of coordinated attack which is happening, which makes the traffic at different routers be correlated. Okay, so it's an interesting and important question to test a statistical model of independence. Okay, and so the way we'll formulate it is in terms of the data stream model. So this is a particular restriction on how we access the data, and perhaps the best way to motivate it is by the database example. So again, let's say that you have n columns in a database, and n may be again very large, and when the when you're reading the rows of this database, so each row is an n tuple. It has values for each of these n columns, right? And now you read it one at a time. You read these rows one at a time, and the question you want to answer is whether the n variables which are represented by the n columns, they are statistically independent or not. Okay, and this is the data stream model. So basically, each time, so there's a monitor which is getting each of the rows one by one. So it's getting each an n tuple, I1 through In, where each ij, I'll suppose there's some value between 1 and k. So it takes one of k values. And the stream monitor wants to test independence between these n coordinates. Okay. And yeah, so the objective is just this. So you have a distribution P on n variables, let's call them x1 through xn. And I want to test how close, whether they are independent or not. So the natural kind of independent, the natural product distribution, which corresponds to P, is the product of the marginals of P. Okay, so if P was indeed independent, if these x1 through xn were indeed n independent variables, then pi sub P would be the same as P, because each so each of these things, right, P of x1 equal to x1 is the marginal of the first variable being equal to x1 times the marginal of the second variable being equal to x2, and so on. And if P was indeed independent, this marginal would, so these n variables are independent. So you could just, by definition of independence, you could just take this product and that would give you the value of P. So pi P equal to P if and only if P is a product distribution, meaning x1 through xn are n independent variables. Okay, and the independence testing question then is to estimate the distance between P and pi P. Okay, And again, we are going to resort to the total variation distance, which I introduced earlier. So it's the maximum difference between two distributions on the mass they put on any event. Okay, and again, as I said, so you can write it in terms of the difference between the probabilities on atomic events, and written in this way, you can think of it as the L1 norm of the difference between these two vectors, p and pi p. So p is the distribution, is the vector where for each, so p is a vector. You can think of p as a vector on k to the n, right? Because x1 through xn, each x1 through xn is like I said in the last thing, right? So each coordinate is takes values between 1 through k. Oops. Okay. Okay, yeah. So each x1 to xn takes values between 1 through k. So there are k to the n many possible values for the domain of p is k of size k to the n. So p assigns some probability to each of these k to the n domain elements. Okay, so you are looking at, so the total variation distance is the L1 norm of the difference between these probability vectors. So the question of independence testing, so sorry, it should be independence testing, is how to estimate this total variation distance. And the key to doing this is in this kind of very nice geometric view of probability distributions on n tuples. So you can think of a probability distribution on n tuples as a tensor. Okay, what is a tensor? Tensor is the multidimensional generalization of a matrix. So in a matrix, it's just a rectangle. In an n-dimensional tensor, it's an n-dimensional cube. So here I have drawn a 3-dimensional tensor, n equal to 3. And p of I1 through In is the number of times. So I1 through In, so each point inside the cube is indexed by n values. So here n is equal to 3. So you have these 3 values, I1, I2, I3, which indexes each point inside the cube, right? And p assigns a value. So what is the probability of I1, I2, I3 in the distribution? Okay, and so the way you can think of it is you have this cube of values that you want to maintain, or this generally this tensor, and it is proportional to the number of times I1 through In appear in the stream. Okay, so the way you can maintain this thing is that you have this tensor. Each time, say like in the database example, each time a row comes in to be I1 through In, you increment the frequency, the coordinate corresponding to I1 through In this tensor by 1. Okay, so that means that you have seen one more count of I1 through In. Okay, and you can keep doing this, so that way you can get a you can maintain, I mean you can get this explicit representation for this probability. Now maintaining this whole cube is actually requires a lot of space, because k to the n is a huge number, and especially we'll think of k as being very large. K is the domain, right? And I mean k we'll think of as being going to infinity. But fortunately, there is some previous work from 15 years ago, which gives an algorithm to estimate the L1 norm of a frequency vector on capital N elements using 1 over epsilon squared log of capital N words of storage. So what does this mean? So let's say that I have, so let's forget about the tensor. So let's just say that I have a distribution on just one variable. So n is equal to 1. So here, I have a probability of, so this is just a vector on k elements. So this is the probability of 1. This is the probability of 2. Dot dot dot. Probability of k. Okay. So this is p, and then we wanted to do minus pi p, right? Pi p was the some other distribution which corresponds to a product distribution, but let's say that again n is equal to 1, so it's just well, okay. I mean, okay. So for the moment, let's just think instead of pi p, let's think you have some other distribution q, okay, and then you have q of 1, q of 2 through q of k. And what index result tells you is that instead of maintaining these k dimensional vectors, what you can do is you can maintain a much smaller, actually a log k dimensional vector. Sorry, I think I'm running out of battery. I'll switch devices if that happens. Sorry about that. So I can maintain a log k dimensional vector, so that if I maintain these log k dimensional vectors, I can estimate the L1 norm of p minus q. Okay. And generally, if instead of k, these vectors are of length capital N, then I could only need log of capital N. So if you had little n, so if you had little n dimensional tensor, this capital N would be k to the power of n, like we said earlier. So basically, the space complexity would be n epsilon minus 2 log of k, okay, because I have substituted k to the n there. This is all okay, but the main problem is that, I mean, here I kind of assumed that I could maintain Q. So Q, so in the for the independence testing problem, Q is again this product of the marginals, and it's not clear how to maintain this tensor representation of pi p of the product of the marginals. Okay, but so this is what we do. So we get a new L1 estimation algorithm for tensors. So you note that pi p is a tensor product of n vectors, because the pi p of x is actually p1 of x times p1 of x1 times p2 of x2 times pn of x, and pi is the marginal on the nth coordinate, on the ith coordinate. So we design a new linear sketch S that, when applied to rank 1 tensors, decomposes into a tensor product. And so all that we need to do is to maintain each of these this should be S1 of P1 through Sn of Pn. And so all that we need to do is to maintain each of these smaller sketches. Okay. So the algorithm really is, so S of P is okay, because P is just the observed distribution, right? So as we said, so we can just update each coordinate at a time. But the marginal, the product of the marginals is tougher to maintain. But so we introduce this new tool so that all that we need to do is actually maintain sketches for each of the marginals, and then we take the tensor product of the sketches. Okay, and each sketch is what's called a subsampling sketch. So this is again quite technical and very difficult to describe in words in a few minutes, but it's a technique of wide applicability and in streaming, and it has a long history. So it has been used previously also, but our application again to tensor sketches is new. And our overall space usage after you do, so these sketches need to be maintained very, very delicately, because, so each time you do a sketch, you blow up the error in our final estimate. So you need to do a more refined sketch in the next layer, and so on. Okay, so there's like a big induction involved, but overall, then our space usage is something like exponential in n squared. So this is a lot, but on the other hand, it improves previous work. So the best improved previous work was space doubly exponential in n, whereas we got exponential in n squared, which is an exponential savings from the doubly exponential. So a big open problem here is to find a polynomial space streaming algorithm for measuring independence of n variables. So it's just the most basic statistical model you can think of, and even here, the result is actually not fully known. And beyond that, this area is actually just emerging. So one can ask for streaming algorithms for other statistical inference problems. So for example, you can look at graphical models like Bayes nets or Markov chains, if you know what these are. And you can ask whether the samples that I'm seeing corresponds to a Markov chain or not. Okay, so with that, I'll end this section of the work. And anyway, I think I'm getting close to the end of my 1 hour. And beyond this, I have interests in many other problems. For example, what if we change this fundamental thesis of data science? So far we have assumed that the data is, each data point is an independent draw from a stream, but what if the data rows are not independent? So for example, time series data, where you have correlations between the different samples that you get, or controllable parameters, where there are some parameters that you can adjust. So it's not just independent, but you have some control over what the sample you're getting. Another class of problems of interest is non-parametric results for hypothesis testing. So here, we have been looking so far at total variation distance, and we saw that total variation distance actually works for Gaussian distributions in the first part of my talk, but it's actually not always appropriate because TV distance is very sensitive to small changes in the distribution. So if you have two distributions and at one point you have epsilon mass and the other has 0, then that actually gives some contribution to the TV distance. Right? So I want to develop understanding for other interesting notions of distance beyond between data distributions beyond total variation distance. And finally, there's another big open field of questions on causal inferences that I'm very interested in, and that basically relates to statistical inference. But what you're inferring is something that cannot be observed, even in principle. So even if you had infinitely many samples, you would not be able to observe it. So you need to manipulate what you have seen so far in order to get the final answer. Okay, but this will take another whole hour, and it's a topic for another talk. Finally, I'm actively looking for new students.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I think my device actually just died. But what I'm saying is I'm actively looking for new students in these topics. So if you're interested, just message me and I'll be very happy to talk.